Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. I think this is a really great episode. I've got Andy Bochman and Sarah Freemen from Idaho National Labs, INL, and they just came out with a new book that's just available now. It's called Countering Cyber Sabotage, and it's all about their CCE methodology that we've been hearing about for years. That's the consequence-driven, cyber-informed engineering methodology. So it was great to get some meat on those bones of what CCE is. And I will tell you, from reading the book and from my interview, I really had a misconception about what CCE is. I thought it was primarily focused on consequence reduction, that it was a consequence reduction methodology. And certainly there is some of that in there, but a lot of it is just classic ICS security assessments that have been done for decades, perhaps with a more detailed methodology and quite frankly, a longer approach. They talk about these things taking 6 to 12 months. So this is a big effort really designed for large organizations and governments. But when you look at it, there's 4 steps. Steps 2 and 3 focus primarily on likelihood. And even step 4, where you get to mitigations, a number of the mitigations are classic ones like reducing attack paths and putting in perimeter security and things of that nature. So those aren't really consequence reductions, they're likelihood reductions. Now, I'm not sure where I got this mistaken impression, because if you really look closely at the title, the first C, consequence driven, okay, it doesn't say consequence reduction methodology, it's a consequence driven methodology. So step 1 in the CCE process is identifying high consequence events. So that's where it's consequence driven, because you spent all your effort looking at the risk related to those high consequence events. I must admit I'm a little disappointed in the methodology, not because it's bad, but because we really could have used a strong consequence methodology. And that's what I was hoping for. But with that aside, it is, I think, an important book, an important methodology. I think it adds a lot to the discussion, the decisions that one might make. I think it's going to make a big difference in those organizations that can afford to spend 6 to 12 months of having a team look at this. Certainly going to make a big difference in the government and maybe some larger, very critical to the U.S. utilities and other critical infrastructure. So I'd encourage you to look at it. I will tell you that in this interview, we cover at the beginning, we focus on exactly who should read the book, how long these things take, how INL is going to train up people to do CCEs, and how many they'll do themselves. So a lot of the more programmatic elements of the CCE rollout. And then after that, we dive into the steps. And you'll see me struggling a little bit as I come to this understanding that it's not a consequence reduction methodology. It's a consequence-driven methodology. And then after that, we go through steps 1 through 4. So I really appreciate the book. My recommendations, I really think chapters 5, 8, and the 2 appendices are great. I think it's worth checking out. And I hope you enjoy my interview with Andy and Sarah. Welcome to the Unsolicited Response Podcast. I'm Dale Peterson. And as my guests today, the authors of Countering Cyber Sabotage describe me, I am one of the most respected, if sometimes polarizing, observers of the OT security space, which I greatly appreciated both of those. That was pretty amusing. But welcome to the podcast. I have Andy Bochman and Sarah Freemen. They are both with Idaho National Labs, INL, and Andy is the Senior Grid Strategist. And Sarah, on LinkedIn, I saw your title as ICS Cybersecurity Analyst. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, well, great. Well, welcome, Andy. I know you're coming back from the second time. We did this back in July 2018. Sarah has spoken at S4 before, but this is the first time I've had you on the podcast.
CCE was a lot more nebulous back then. It's the dust is starting to come together, and it's something that's more tangible.
Definitely. And first of all, you have my respect for writing a book. I mean, that is incredibly difficult. The book's title is Countering Cyber Sabotage, and then the subtitle is Consequence-Driven Cyber-Informed Engineering, or CCE. And we'll probably use CCE most of the time during this discussion just because it's shorter. But Andy, where can someone get the book now? Is it available? Where can they get it?
I think the operative word is now, and depending on when someone's listening to this, now shifts. But as of today, the 27th of January, in theory, according to the publisher, CRC Press, Taylor and Francis, it was published on Inauguration Day, a marketing strategy designed for maximum impact. There wouldn't be anything else going on that day, so I understand why they chose it. I think it was a glitch in the system or the matrix. Anyway, it both seems to be for sale on Amazon and on the publisher's website, and yet there are signs today that it probably hasn't reached the warehouse yet. So they want you to know about it and read about the authors and what it's about and who endorsed it and all. But I don't think you can expect a copy in the next few days. We're keeping an eye on it. Let's say maybe early February, you should be able to expect copies.
You can definitely pre-order it. I saw that on Amazon.
True.
So it's available for pre-order on Kindle as well as hard copy.
That's right.
I think one of the things when I read a book, I always try to get in the author's head and try to figure out, who was this book written for? Who did you want to read this book? The role, the sector, the psychographic personality. Andy, who did you write this for?
Okay, that's a nice question. Some people told me at the beginning, my boss, Zach Tudor, by the way, is the one who told me to write the book. I thought we had perhaps said enough to get the ball rolling with the HBR article a couple years ago. He's like, no, write the book. It's the stake in the ground for the methodology. And we mentioned that in the book too. Then, since I'm a first-time author, I asked some questions of other authors or of publishers. They said it's got to be one thing or the other. It's either got to be a general reader or a reader for policy people and boardroom people, the man and woman on the street and the man and woman on the hill. Or it's got to be a technical book, a textbook, something for engineers and cyber geeks, something with a lot of depth in that. It can't be, or it shouldn't be both. So I listened to that counsel, and yet, as you saw from your read through before this podcast, it is actually both. The front matter, heavy on Mike Asante and the origins and some of the background of the lab, so people have context, is something anyone can read and understand and hopefully appreciate. But it is all a setup as you get through the first few real chapters for the breakdown in detail of the methodology itself. I think that's chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 5, 6, 7, 8. And there you're going in for practitioners. Those people need to know some engineering, or I should say it this way, people who will be motivated to read those parts, to explore the methodology in a more granular way, will be engineers, people that do operations, that try to do OT cybersecurity, and who perhaps will find this solves some of the problems that they've had up until now in a way that they really enjoy. And then it ends with a last chapter that looks towards the future, again, that I think is generally readable by everybody. So to answer your question, it's not sector specific, though we're from Idaho National Lab. You're going to see that when we talk about electricity, that's really our home territory, and our mega appendix, which we can talk about separately later on if you want, is a case study about an attack on a fictional country. Sounds like it's an Eastern European fictional country. And that's for hardcore techies, to be sure. So okay. It's for a lot of people.
And I think, Sarah, you had mentioned that you really focus on threats. So maybe I'll point this at you. So in the book, and I had to put on my glasses because I have so many quotes from your book here in my notes here, but the first one is, how do you decide if your organization would benefit from CCE? The answer is simple. If your company is in any way, shape, or form associated with the production, transportation, or delivery of a service or function directly related to the critical infrastructure, you are a target of cyber sabotage. So I guess when I was looking at that, I was thinking, well, does that mean if I'm in manufacturing, this book isn't applicable, or is it just more applicable to some than the others? Who would you say outside, if you're not critical infrastructure, I guess to ask it a question, is this book still applicable to you?
Well, the first thing I would say is critical infrastructure is one of those things that is really challenging to define, especially if you use the DHS definitions. Those tend to be all-encompassing. So critical manufacturing actually does make the qualifications for critical infrastructure. But I think the spirit of the book is more trying to get to the point that if you take a step back and you evaluate who you are and what your company is providing as a service, there are a lot. You really have to draw the line to include many, many more organizations as targets. And this is something we've seen the evolution of over the last 10 years in the threat space. There's just a lot more targeting of different types of organizations.
Okay. So critical manufacturing makes sense. I guess if I'm a food manufacturer, and I have 50 plants, I personally, I thought, well, the CCE and certainly the focus on consequence is of value. I mean, I do think, Andy, even though it took a couple of years to get the book out, this effort that you and I would point to like a Brian Singer and a Ralph Langner and a John Cusimano and the CCE briefings have really raised the profile of the consequence side of the risk equation, which is really important, I think, and we'll probably hit throughout this. And the book actually says CCE is uniquely focused on consequence prevention. If you were to look at someone reading this book or going through the CCE process, what would be the goal or the desired outcome as they came out the other side of it?
I think so much depends on where you are in the world. I don't mean geographically, I mean more sort of organizationally. If you're in national security and your charge is to protect the security of a nation versus you're an executive or a senior or anyone really in a corporation, what's critical and what the consequences are that you're trying to avoid change significantly. If I understand your question right, at the end of a CCE engagement, we don't do anything. I know people, SMEs, who actually treat this as an OJT sort of. We do it. It looks like we're sort of doing it to or for an entity, but actually we're doing it with if you could imagine my arm being cast wide, we're doing it with an organization and leaving behind some knowledge that they gained along the way over the several months of the engagement and some recommendations about mitigations. Now, those recommended mitigations, were they to act on them after they've decided cost benefit, whether they're willing to do them or not, should leave them feeling substantially safer in the world as they read about the heinous cyber attack du jour. And at the time of this recording, it's still Sunburst, but there'll be others in the future to be sure. They should be able to, and it's a really overused cliche, but they should be able to sleep a little bit more soundly knowing that they, one, know what their real crown jewels are, process and function wise. They thought they knew before, but now they really know in a way that's high confidence. And two, they will probably get a sense from interacting with INL people that they are a target. They are a reasonable target, even if they never imagined themselves to be one in the past. Once they understand from speaking with our folks, from some of their experiences, that they really do have a few more things to be concerned about than they might have thought before when they were considering ransomware or just industrial espionage. And lastly, what did we say about you in the quote, polarizing or controversial? Yes. One of the things about CCE, right, is if we say you need to do all the things that you're doing now, and the book says this too, please keep doing all the things you're doing now. We bicker over what a good placeholder term for that is. What is it? Not sanitation.
Cyber hygiene.
Thank you. Sorry, that slipped out of my head. I thought not to ever say that word to Dale, but there it is. So the sum total of all the things you do today, which involve products and people and training and partnerships and all that, keep doing those things. But what we say in the book and what we say in person is those things are necessary but not sufficient. There's a Mike Asante quote on that as well. Sufficient for keeping ankle biters at bay, but if certain top tier adversaries come calling for you, they will go through those things and they will have their way with you.
Okay.
CCE is designed so that when that happens, you have thought through the most likely scenarios that those folks are going to try to do to hurt you the most, maybe to hurt you particularly, or to hurt the nation that you serve. And you've removed a lot of the possible very bad things that they could do. And that's a good thing.
We're going to dive into the 4 phases in a second. I just want to knock out a couple other things quickly, just kind of a stats sort of thing. How many of these CCEs has INL done approximately to date?
Sorry, you can correct me if you know more, but either at some stage in the process from fully complete, and it's never really fully complete because we keep responding to questions afterwards for clarification, to things that are mid-course underway right now, to things that we're getting started right now. I'd say between a dozen and maybe 18 altogether. Okay.
And in the book, you say they take about 6 to 12 months elapsed time. You note that in the book. And it was funny, though, I don't know if you know this, either one of you, but you mentioned in there that a East Coast water utility took the information that you had provided in general and did a self-assessment, a CCE self-assessment. Do you have any idea how long it took them with their methodology?
I think from the time they read the HBR article to the time they kind of wrapped up and reported back out to the CEO, who was a sponsor, was also about 6 months.
Okay.
And this is because as you are polarizing in the wider world of ICS security, I am polarizing even inside INL, and I think I've heard you and maybe Ralph Langner, Tim Conway even say some pieces of this thing don't require the full force of the United States government Idaho blast. That there are some fundamental elements, and we can do that when we do the phase walkthrough, that are just common sense if you think about it the right way. And so some benefit can be had without having to get into this long queue of a USG-sponsored engagement. And there'll be partnership conversation as well.
Well, let's extend that a little bit. And I don't know, Sarah, if you were involved in this or not, but you do actually mention there, because you start to look, okay, INL's done 6 to 12. We've got this huge backlog, and I normally think of private industry, but obviously you're supporting the government. There's a large amount of critical government ICS that would need this sort of thing. And it was good to see in the book they actually talk about how you're going to scale this in terms of training. You said very few organizations will be able to have an INL-led CCE engagement, at least in the near term. But you've got a couple of training plans in order to get other people up to speed as to how to do this. I don't know, Sarah, if you're familiar with that, could you go over that? Or if not, Andy?
Sure. And I'm sure Andy has some more details too. We have kind of different perspectives on that. But as you're aware, there is a very long list of organizations that would participate or have interest in participating in an INL-led engagement. But the real value of CCE isn't something that takes, even if you pick the 100 most important organizations of the United States government, if it takes us 20 years to go through the assessments, that's missing the point. So part of what we're trying to do is initiate very quickly a change in philosophy. You asked kind of what do we hope organizations get out of this? And it's the realization that if you change how you evaluate, how you expend limited resources like time and money, then considering the benefit to the adversary for a certain attack path means that there are things that you should focus on immediately and things that can go to the back of that list. The same way, in this training session, and we've got a couple of different options, one of which is called this Accelerate, which is more of a basic introduction for organizations that are probably not going to receive a full INL-led engagement. It introduces those organizations to some of the key starting concepts with thinking about how adversaries will target organizations. Like, how do they evaluate what the most critical assets are, and how do they go about collecting the data necessary to perform some of those more complex cyber attacks. So that philosophy change is impactful regardless of how much you go through the process. Although obviously, if you're looking for the full impact where you get through the protections and mitigations phase, it's helpful if you can then have the full engineering analysis to identify those places of best return.
And I saw that it looked like the Accelerate course was a 2-day course. Is that up and running, or is that to come?
Yeah, it's been run, but guess what? If you're viewing this or listening to this podcast from the far future, back when there isn't a pandemic anymore, we, like almost every other organization in the land, maybe every training organization, had to redo our everything about the way we deliver training, and so now it's virtual. That doesn't mean the face-to-face ones aren't there waiting to be brushed off and done again. But instead of 2 full days in person, we've broken it up into 4 4-hour sessions. Typically would be 4 days in a week. And one thing we've realized, I think we always had that plan to have a virtual thing, but it probably would have been deprioritized for a long time. And suddenly it became the most important thing in the universe. And so we made it. We have some really excellent training resources and training designers. You know, INL is the home of red team, blue team training, which is one of the things. If nobody in the cyber world knows anything else about INL, they know red team, blue team training, and Marty Edwards and the ICS cert and all that stuff. We're going to be able to scale training in some ways more than we would have been before, when we said you can only have 20 people in seats and we'll be there in person. We've already done accelerate trainings virtually, where the utility said, is it okay if we add more? And even though we have breakout sessions and small group activities virtually through a learning management system, we said, yeah, and they ended up putting 3 times as many people in seats and said they had a great experience. So I think that bodes really well for INL being able to deliver more training. But as we license partners and help them stand up the accelerate training materials and all, they should be able to do one-to-many. And maybe by the time we reach mid-year this year, we'll be hitting a lot of people, is the hope.
Okay. And then the last question before we get into the phases is there, the book also hinted that there's some more advanced CCE team training with, I reading between the lines almost sounded like a CCE certified team or something like that. What's that going to be? Has that been fleshed out yet?
The internal term we use is boot camp. Maybe it's like SEAL training. It just means that there'll be, whereas anybody can go through Accelerate and get something out of it, and they can go through it. There'll be some prerequisites of some significant experience in various engineering or targeting or OT security disciplines, process and safety, just to get in the door. And then the team training, aka boot camp, will go on for quite some time. So there'll be some face-to-face elements, longer than Accelerate, and then there's going to be a lot of shadowing and OJT, and then you still may or may not be blessed. I don't know, the word certified is a little tricky, but you'll either be somebody that's qualified to do what we call tier 1 engagements and training, or you won't be. And some of the people in that class might cry. It's supposed to be that fun, but there should be some pride if you survive as well.
Well, I think that approach makes sense, where you have the simpler class for people that maybe want to roll their own, and then people that want to offer this as a service to augment the capabilities of the lab, or others can go through that. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's dive into it here, because I think we're going to be good on 1 and 4. I think we're going to have some interesting discussions on 2 and 3. So it's a 4-phased approach, and we'll put up a little diagram showing those 4 phases. The first one is consequence prioritization, and you give the kind of the simplified explanation that you're trying to find high consequence events, and once you've narrowed the list down to 5 or 10 of the worst scenarios, you're almost ready to move to phase 2. So maybe we're looking at high consequence events here. Sarah, maybe I'll let you take this one. What constitutes a high consequence event? How does someone know if they have a high consequence event?
Well, focusing on critical infrastructure, one of the reasons why we're able to, I guess, make that clear distinction is because industrial control systems control cyber physical systems. There's a physical consequence to cyber manipulation. So that dictates that, in general, the worst case scenarios that we start with have to do with physical damage. And that was something that we really wanted to prioritize first, because oftentimes physical damage coincides with things like a health and safety risk to people, and or an environmental risk, or a significant financial cost to the companies themselves. So if you start with the concept of how would somebody achieve physical damage, the challenging part there is, depending on what organization you're looking at. For example, if you started with somebody who was not a traditional critical infrastructure entity, or perhaps think of something like a communications integrator for a distribution management system. That's something we deal with a lot at INL, doing the energy sector work. Under normal circumstances, their infrastructure, by definition, it would be quite challenging to result in a cyber event that results in physical damage. So sometimes you have to walk back that initial starting point of the discussion. But we find that that's at least a very good starting point mentally for people to imagine where they should begin thinking about the worst that could happen.
And I think we talked a little bit about this in our July 2018 podcast, but a lot of organizations already know what the really bad things are, either from a PHA or just from their own investigations where they need to put safety and protection in place. They say, if this thing explodes, or if this, these really bad things can happen. And as you described there, a lot of it is just figuring out if there is a cyber way to cause this physical, really bad thing to happen. And I should note that, and I like this too, you guys actually had an equation on how to calculate this that included area impacted, duration, attack breadth, system integrity, safety, cost. And then if you go to Appendix A that Andy had mentioned, they talk about this fictional example, and they actually go through how you can do that calculation. So I thought that part of the book was really good to show people how to do that. Not that it's perfect. I mean, someone else could argue a different equation, but it at least is showing you the factors and how you could do that. Andy, one part of the book talked about the people that needed to be involved in deciding this. What kind of roles need to be involved in deciding these high consequence events?
I think it's going to be a mix, right? It's going to be people as close to the money as the CFO and as close to the functions, operations, and processes as not just, say, an operations officer, but 1, 2, or 3 level management and operator levels below that person. It also might be related to a dependency on a certain partner for a certain piece of the process pie. And so knowing someone who has particularly good visibility on that partner can be part of the equation too. One thing I want to say about the equation that we proffer in the book is that it's intended to be flexible and adjustable depending on the organization. So it's definitely different when we're with the DoD. They will use some of those categories, but they might omit some others that aren't relevant as not being a commercial entity. They might add a new category. I think the main thrust of it is what are all the things that matter to you, different ways of measuring them. And then when we start to develop these scenarios to tease out high consequence events, it gives a way for us, and as I said, we're not doing it to people, we're doing it with them, to rack and stack so that we can find the worst thing of all possible high consequence events, and then work our way down, because it's quantified at the end, right? It's an equation that produces a number. So that way you can go, okay, we came up with 40 high consequence events out of these scenarios, but we don't have time, and you don't want to take the time for us to go through all of those. Let's draw an arbitrary cutoff line on the top 6 or the top 10. Let's work those through all 4 phases. That means that, say you do 6, that will provide a satisfactory response, including phase 4 mitigations and protections. And when we leave, we've still left you with number 7, 8, and 9, and the rest of the thing there, that at some point we're pretty serious. We just decided we didn't want to work them through together. We thought we'd get out of your hair. That you can now, armed with what you've learned, including the book and the manual and all that stuff, and go back at those things and try doing it on your own.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts here. One is, it's good to have the equation because some organizations require that rigor. right? They want, when they get the report, especially when they hire an organization like INL or use an organization like
Sure.
INL or something, they methodology, rigor, formulas become really important to them. I would say in practice, I found it's usually not that hard. It's like, oh, this is the really bad thing. We can't let this happen.
Sarah is closer to these engagements than I am, or at least has been in the past. And I don't live near a skiff here in Milwaukee. But all I can say is anecdotally from the team, there's always something. There's always something that meaning they have a partial answer, and maybe they have an almost full answer to what are the worst things that could happen. But there's always you have to have the adversarial mindset that so many of my evil colleagues have, and they're able to find things and shine light on them that the asset owner, say it's an asset owner, at first says that's not right, and after they get shown a little bit more, go, holy hand grenades.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with that. What I'm saying is that the detailed formula, once they truly understand the process and the things, the formulas, as I saw even in the example in your book, wasn't really that necessary. You could just read them and you say, yeah, this one's much more serious than that. But the formula gives you the rigor you want. And the other thing I wanted to mention was, and it actually relates back to our last podcast, but I was thrilled that you put the CFO or the finance up front, because a lot of times we see the operations people think something is terribly serious, and the company kind of says, it's okay. And we even, back in 2018, you said it, and I agreed. You said, well, if a large power utility loses some generation capability, that's going to be a real serious event. And, thinking a little bit more about it, a lot of times it isn't. A lot of times they can just buy the power. It's like, so the operations guy said, we lose this plant for 2 weeks, it's a catastrophe. And the finance guy said, yeah, we lose a little bit of money because we have to buy instead of make it, but we can calculate that, and that's a couple $100,000,
That conversation is exactly why we have an equation, because I had to sit through days worth of arguments about different people's perspective about what the outcome would be of hypothetical attacks. I think a lot of people go into it and they say, oh, no, we're all working for the same company. We all have the same mission. We all have the same goal, deliver power to our customers. And then you start to peel back the layers and you say, well, what system is most important to do that? And then it starts to crumble. And then you say, well, if we can only do one of these things, if we can only prioritize things like safety or finances, which one is it going to be? And you'd be surprised how quickly people start to recognize their differences answering those questions. So it's a little bit of a mental experiment. I don't think the formula is super valuable by itself, but it's really easy, especially after SolarWinds, for example, to look at something and just get spun up really quickly without recognizing or taking stock of what the potential impact could be. So if you force people into that analytic mindset, then they really have they have to validate their assumptions.
And it also
Dale,
gives them a little guardrails too, I would imagine too. Okay, yes, Andy.
That example, that example that we cite in the book, and that we probably even mentioned in 2018, which seems to work for lay people. To your point about we can get electricity from elsewhere, depending where you are on the grid in the United States or elsewhere. That's right. But it's a statement made in Congress by the CEO of the first utility to go through this, and he said, and I'll botch it a little bit, but I can handle disruption. They're in Florida. They get disrupted constantly, and they're good at dealing with it and getting back fast. What I can't handle is long lead. Sorry, I can handle disruption, not destruction of long lead time to replace capital equipment. For example,
you actually quote the CEO of Florida Power and Light. I can deal with disruption. What I can't handle is destruction of long lead time to replace capital equipment. Yeah. So an outage might be okay, but actually destroying equipment is something different. Okay, so let's jump forward, because this is where it gets a little meaty. So now, before we get to phase 2, I think we have to talk about likelihood, because and this is something that I had a real trouble with, and then I just relooked at your title, and your title says consequence driven. So it's not a consequence focused or a consequence only. It's a consequence driven cyber informed information. But you spend like the first introduction and 4 chapters essentially making the case, as I read it, to simplify it, that you have to, if you're critical infrastructure, you have to assume the likelihood is 1. And I could read a bunch of quotes here, the gap between the attacker and defender capabilities and widening. Complexity has created a situation where the current approaches to cyber defense are incapable of stopping well-resourced, targeted attackers from creating potentially catastrophic results. So in one sense, you're saying, and we've argued about this before, Andy, where you said, if you're critical infrastructure, you will be targeted. If you are targeted, you will be compromised, and so on. I guess I have a problem with that still, because we just don't see it. The data just doesn't support that. And while I'm a real fan on the consequence side, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I view your point as likelihood is 1, whereas when I'm looking at this, my perspective is likelihood is not 0. That consequence is high and likelihood, I can't say likelihood is 0. So am I misstating you there, or what's your view on the likelihood question?
Can I please answer this, Andy?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I was going to say, I'm going to struggle and say something, and then please, Sarah will back me up. So I want you to just save my bacon right away.
I would love to save your bacon right away. So threat is probability, times consequence, motivation, probability, consequence, depending on which one you look at. It assumes a threat actor is motivated to attack you. These are equations that you see, or variants thereof, all throughout cybersecurity. The problem is threat intelligence is in a lot of ways a very new field, and we tend to argue a lot about certain nuance. What's the significance of this attack? What about this attack? So rather than focus the first layer of the defenses on what the threat actor is doing, we're trying to take a step back and say, what is the worst case scenario the threat actor can achieve? And that comes from the reality that you're going to have very imperfect information with regards to the adversary. That being said, there is if 100 level is assume likelihood of 1, because by the way, if you multiply impact by some version thereof, it's not as clean. So it's better just to multiply by 1. That's why the equation's like that. But if you assume some variation thereof, like some fraction of 1, the problem becomes, I guess at the 200 level, you want to start to say, what do I have evidence from threat intelligence? What have we seen evidence of in the real world? What attacks have we witnessed that could be applied to my architecture? All of those things also need to be discussed. But if you start with consequence, then even if you readjust based on threat actor activity, it's a fractional weight versus focusing on the worst, greatest, latest cyber attack. And so it's trying to really redirect that focus into more strategic defense versus just response. So this is more of a proactive defensive strategy, knowing that I don't necessarily have perfect awareness of the adversary's offensive strategy.
Yep. And I'm inclined to agree with you as you describe it that way, that, again, that I can't, if I have a system, I can't be confident that this high consequence event that we determined in phase 1 could be done by a cyber attack. I don't have confidence that that is 0, that the likelihood of that happening is 0 if I'm facing a skilled, well-resourced adversary, that they could find a way. I guess one of the problems I have with those first 4 chapters is I read those first 4 chapters as more like, look, it's going to happen. You guys you're gonna get wiped out. You're gonna get someone with administrative rights in your network. Full stop. If you're critical infrastructure, and I guess have you guys? I just haven't seen any evidence of that yet.
And this is the tricky thing. This is super tricky. And then I'll totally let you speak after this. I swear.
Okay.
Cyber warfare. targeting critical infrastructure is based on the premise that organizations will develop weapons to attack these targets, but not necessarily use them.
That's true.
So the logic is faulty to say that this doesn't occur. I have no evidence of this occurring, so it's not occurring. That is exactly the trap we're trying to avoid. There's no reason to expect anything like that until various serious circumstances. So with critical infrastructure, it's imperative that we kind of change our calculus for how we think about preparing for these kinds of things.
Okay. I agree. And I actually wrote a paper on that, preparation and persistence, that you just can't, the bad guys can't just snap their finger on a day and say, okay, now I want you to take out the power. They have to be in there. They have to have learned the system. And we just don't know that. I guess my 2 cents is I still am the belief that you're better off saying the case is non-zero and the consequences are so high. It's more of the black swan argument than it is the critical infrastructure.
But that makes the math harder.
Yeah.
and you are the question asker and we're the question answerer, except for what if we ask you and say all the time and money that's spent trying to determine probability to several degrees. What do people get from that? And especially when they know that whatever number they came up with is not right, or they don't have much confidence that they're right about the probability that they determine. What do they get for that? Why not just have it be one if your critical infrastructure, know that there is a strong likelihood that you will be targeted? And what kind of a day do you want to have? Even if the decision is never made to pull the trigger, it can be used to influence the behavior of governments, of companies, and other folks. It seems simpler, and a lot of people can use simple when our world is so complex.
Yeah, I think we're in violent agreement that spending a lot of effort trying to come up with that precise likelihood number and pretending that you have a high degree of confidence in that number is a fool's errand. I mean, it's not possible today with the information we have. I just prefer the approach that it's non-zero as opposed to one. But we'll just disagree on that.
That's good. I think maybe we should just do a virtual handshaking on that, because I think that may be what is it called? A difference without a
distinction. Yeah.
Distinction.
So
in a sense,
I forgot to ask you. So on phase one, about what percentage? Obviously, these are rough numbers, but what percentage of the time of a CCE is spent on phase one?
Sarah, you take?
So in a perfect world, it would be a quarter of the time. The reality is, I think the things that we're asking people to do in phase one are challenging. I think because of that, it's almost a third or half. I mean, you start approaching it. Yeah, everybody looks at it and it's like, oh, it should be a quarter, or I could see some of these tasks taking so hard. The reality is, once you switch people, once you change their mindset, it's really interesting, especially the vast majority of the time is spent doing phase one and phase two. But before they're done with phase two, they've already jumped to phase four. And you have to be like, wait. No, we have to articulate what this would look like. Once people get it, they want to fix the things that they've seen right away. And then it's just going through the motions. It's almost instantaneous. But you'll have several weeks of discussions before they get to that point.
Okay. Well, that surprises me, because I thought phase two and phase three, just based on the description in the book, is where most of the work would go on. Now, in phase two, that's systems of systems analysis. And to me, and I'd even say phase two and phase three, to me, are very traditional assessment activities. I see very little that's consequence based there. I mean, for example, it says capture the full playing field. Adversaries must leverage to gain access, capture credentials, maneuver, observe, learn, and eventually put code in position. Know all the information, manufacturer, product name, version, patch version, known vulnerabilities, update process, patch process. Essentially, you're trying to learn the whole system in phase two, and then it looked like in phase three you're getting that's consequence-based targeting. You're looking at attack paths and such to be through using the cyber kill chain in your case to go through it. So to me, this is where the name consequence doesn't seem to fit, because here we're talking about a lot of things that affect the likelihood of someone being able to get in a position to cause the consequence. And that's where you can put in security controls to reduce the likelihood. So again, Andy, we had this conversation a couple of times already. Maybe I'll ask Sarah, get a different answer. But why would I bother doing phase 2 and phase 3 if all I want to do is get rid of the high consequence events?
Do you want me to go, Andy? Or do you want to take the first
Yeah.
stab at that? Oh, you're muted, Andy. That's why I get to go.
He's looking for a fresh answer, Sarah. So
Okay. All
Good
right.
luck.
So the first thing I will say is phase 2 is hardly the most unique approach. Like you said, it's a pretty standard thing. Let's assess our infrastructure. Let's understand the connections, understand who's providing our services, data exchanges, interdependencies. The only benefit really from the consequence-based approach, which again comes from the first phase, not so much the second phase, is you're not trying to swallow the whole ocean in one gulp. You're starting with those things that are only directly related to that first consequence. That being said, I think phase 3 has a lot going for it in terms of the consequence approach. Because if you just started with the consequence in phase 1 and jumped to phase 4, you tend to waste time and money on certain things that actually aren't feasible. So it's only in phase 3 where you really start to lay out, based on the data you've collected in phase 2, this scenario we worried about, perhaps it scored third most severe, is the only one in the top 5 that's feasible as defined. There's lots of things that sound really bad on paper that score very high based on consequence, but when you stop to take a look at your architecture, there may be other unintentional engineering controls that are already in place that make it not possible. And so that's why it's kind of helpful that you go through that process. Otherwise, you tend to spin your wheels a little bit in phase 4.
Just to be clear, you said engineering controls. Did you mean that? So you don't consider if a cyber control would, in theory, stop it, that would not be considered acceptable?
In general, that is true, although specific cases aside. Sometimes there are situations where, as defined, it sounds okay, like the cyber controls you have in place are sufficient. But as you start to peel back the layers, if you start and look at spec sheets, if you start to talk to specific vendors, sometimes things that are supposed to be unidirectional suddenly are bidirectional. And it's not something that anybody did maliciously. It's just something someone failed to note. And so I think that people sometimes assume that their cybersecurity controls are sufficient, and their network designs are sufficient when that's not necessarily the case. So there are some assumptions that need to be validated in order to increase the protection of the system writ large.
Yeah, I'll give Andy a chance here too, but I'm with you on that. And actually, I almost think that I believe more in the CCE than INL does, because I hear what you say, and I think about what you're saying is, and you cover this very many places in the book, you're saying, we're going to assume that the bad guys have administrative access where they want, and they have skills and knowledge, and they have resources. And if I assume all those things, then I don't really care about all the efforts it would take to get there. I don't care about all the inventory. I don't care about attack paths and kill chains and such, because almost like a pen test or an assessment are saying, well, we don't know how we could get there. We couldn't find a way to get there today, but maybe we didn't think of it, or maybe 6 months from now it's changed and someone can get there. I'm just going to assume they're going to get there. So I don't need to do all this stuff. So to me, it seems like a massive deviation, and reading it carefully, I just was like, why do I even bother doing this? And Andy, I know we've had this discussion, but I've given my side again. Why don't you dive into this?
Well, I think I learned something just now from Sarah's response, which was by going through 2 and 3, and the level of detail in phase 2, I think, goes beyond what most sane organizations would ever think of doing in terms of developing as close to perfect knowledge of the entire ecosystem that is waiting to be, or potentially exploitable by the adversary. You're trying to make yourself as knowledgeable, or if possible, more so than the very skilled adaptive adversary that's been in your systems and learning your processes and understanding the different versions and patch levels of your software, perhaps to a degree that you didn't have before. So you start to gain that. The reason it's at all tractable is that phase one means you don't do it for your whole enterprise. You do it for a comparative handful of things. The thing I learned from Sarah was that, and I sort of knew it, but I had to hear it again, is that by going through 2, but then into 3, which is called consequence targeting, that you actually don't have to recommend mitigations or protections for some things that it looked like up until that point you had to, because there was no viable attack path through the labyrinth of your systems to create the end effect, the high consequence effect. So you're sort of saving all the list of things that you would feel like you had to do. You're whittling it down to again, I keep using the comparative handful term, but to fewer things that you really must do at the end because you did that work of consequence targeting.
Okay. And I think that the one point there that maybe I didn't appreciate as much is you've potentially limited what you have to do phase 2 and phase 3 to based on this. So maybe you have a smaller system that you're doing the systems of systems analysis, or basically understanding the system, and phase 3 consequence-based targeting, where you're actually going through the attack path. I would say, though, in phase 2, I thought the HCE, high consequence event block diagrams, high-level functional sketch made sense. So that was a small part of it. And also in phase 3, where you actually look more at the engineering to make sure that this really bad thing would actually happen, exclusive of the cyber. There's some value there. I almost think, just unsolicited advice, unsolicited response here is, I almost think that the description you give in the first 4 chapters sells short what is accomplished here, because essentially you are taking a consequence-based approach and then giving them a tremendous set of information across the 5 NIST factors, including likelihood reduction. I mean, you finish one of these things, you've got a lot of things beyond just consequence reduction as part of this work.
Just remember and I forget how many things I'm carrying around in my head separate from what was written in the book and what is in the book. But the main purpose of going through this process is not to become better for a moment in time by gaining that knowledge. It's to actually change the way, and I think Sarah touched on it in one of her earlier remarks, actually change the way you think, to change the way you look at these risks, and change the way you understand what an adversary could do if you keep on the path that you've been on all this time. We're trying to leave an organization and its personnel transformed so that they don't need us anymore. And even if they're transformed, I always say that, and that they've got the religion that the job still isn't done in that organization until they've codified it, that it becomes policy, so that when these certain key members leave because they retire or they go to another company, it just becomes, because it's policy, it's the way everybody does business from that point on.
Okay, and then let's get to phase 4, mitigations and protections. Again, I love phase 4, the idea of non-digital protections or non-digital mitigations that can prevent even this highly skilled, highly resourced attacker with administrative access from being successful. Sarah, do you have some examples of non-digital mitigations? Or
I think
Andy, you can take that if you want.
Yeah, either way. I'll let Andy go. I want to hear what Andy says to this one.
I'm kind of an outsider, Dale, of INL. I mean, they put food on my table and hold my security clearance, so I'm sort of on the inside too. But I don't live in Idaho, and that's a difference. There are more of us now. What I'm trying to get at is, in a long-winded fashion, when I asked for, I have built this book with Sarah's help by interviewing people in the core team, some people that can't really talk in the outside world comfortably. And when I said, okay, we're in chapter 4 now, we're in phase 4 now, give me some examples, because this is one of the things that really distinguishes this methodology from going to the Moscone Center every year and cruising the exhibition hall and buying the latest super mega AI-informed firewalls. This is different. These solutions are a whole different solution set for cyber problems. So actually, I built this list that I'll read five types of things off of it, from interviewing people like Jim McGlone at Connexus and John Cusimano at AE Solutions. These are they coming from the world of safety systems and PHA, process hazards analysis, and cyber PHA. Can you create any of these explosive, dangerous things via cyber means? Those things, as you said earlier, those aren't necessarily company-ending events, but for the people in operations, they're safety and OSHA, and so they got to do these things. Some of the things that our folks have used, and this is anecdotal, fall into a class of safety devices and mechanisms, such as pressure relief devices. So if something's been told to overpressure and blow up and really hurt itself, pressure release devices, which often is not, can just be mechanical, can save the day, giving you enough time to respond. Mechanical overspeed trips. I'm thinking of maybe something that happened with centrifuges. If something is told to kill itself by going too fast, maybe not in a way as exciting as the Aurora demonstration at INL in 2007 or 8, but something a little bit more subtle, but nevertheless causes the thing to kill itself or ruin the thing that it was intended to build. Those trips that say, don't kill yourself, go to sleep. And we'll figure out through forensics what happened and we'll stand up and have an okay day. That's in that spirit of that earlier quote from the Florida CEO on disruption okay, destruction not okay. Other categories are check valves, motor monitoring devices, and this one's a little bit longer, instrument loop current monitor relays. For example, analog things that mimic some digital things. Selective use of these types of things. Sometimes I think our folks have found that they're already in place to a certain extent. Sometimes they're in place by accident, and sometimes they're undermined by the digital connectivity that they've installed, and that a simple rewiring can help them achieve the full benefit of these mechanical or analog safety devices. The other one, which we talk about and sometimes people poke at, is reinserting the man or the woman in the loop that was taken out for efficiency reasons to save cost. But the man and the woman in the loop can sometimes play an extremely valuable role in noticing something that the digital devices that had been spoofed wouldn't be telling them.
Yeah, I think Brian Singer gave a good example of that at S4, way back like maybe S415, where they actually had to call someone down in the room, get them on the phone, and have them look at a gauge before the operator would press this certain button. So you certainly can do that, and those are very effective. I did notice in the chapter and in the example in Appendix A that there were some very typical security controls in there as well. Perimeter security, two-factor authentication, which again, to me, takes you away from the consequence side that you're reducing the likelihood that someone's going to be able to do this.
Sure.
Limiting attack paths and things of that nature. So not completely clean, but I will note that in the chapter and in the example, you seem to prefer the non-digital, the unhackable systems.
Yeah, Tim Roxy would say the deterministic versus probabilistic defenses, and we can't be we can't be pure on this, or to have the perfect be the enemy of the good. So where possible, and where financially they have to pencil it out on their side, the asset owner. Where possible, we would recommend these things that are more demonstrably protective of them. It's not always possible, and so sometimes we'll say putting monitoring in choke points where we know the adversary, because of what we learned in phase 2 and 3, we know the adversary will have to pass through the Fulda gap or something equivalent of that. And so we're going to watch that like hawks in a way that we didn't even know that we had to or that we should in the past. Okay,
I'm almost out of time here. I think the last thing that surprised me a little bit is when you're talking about these mitigations, you had a preference in terms of the order of them. You said you like protection by far the best, and then you kind of went down from there. I was surprised that recovery was so low. because in this increasingly, let's say, DevOps thinking world where you say, I'm going to not just stop the attack, but I'm going to say the attack may happen, and it's just not going to matter that much to me. It's going to be maybe a bad day, but not a catastrophic day if this thing happens. I was surprised recovery was so low. Was it protection and then everything under protection, or do you really see recovery at the bottom where it was in the text?
Sarah, do you want to give it a try, or shall
Sure,
I?
I can do it. So I think that the answer to your question, Dale, actually originates partially in phase 3, which we kind of glossed over. When you're doing the attack path analysis, you fixate on you're supposed to start actually, we talk about being upside down and starting from the central point and going out. Everybody gets confused by this. But if you consider the consequence and the technical target for that physical damage being the core thing that's being targeted and develop your attack trees out, what you tend to find is it's almost impossible to identify sufficient boundary defenses to stop the initial infection. But if you can stop that goal, that last event, the stage 2 portion of the attack for ICS, then recovery is by definition lessened to some extent. So if you consider then the 5 functions and we ignore identify because that's what you're doing in phase 2, then you're left with protect, detect, respond, and recover. I would argue that respond and recover are treated at an equal level on the ladder, but do sit less than detect and protect. If you can protect proactively, then hopefully you have nothing to clean up from. If you can detect quickly and respond effectively, then similarly, some of the cost of the attack is quite low. But respond and recover, those go hand in hand. Sometimes the potential cost of an attack and the cost to mitigate it completely, for example, eliminating a core network asset that is being used by multiple parties, it just doesn't make sense to get rid of it. But everybody's knowingly gone into that decision, and they've looked at all of the pluses and minuses and said, it's okay, we're going to accept this cyber risk. The risk that this might be used against us because the value we're getting from it is so high. So in those cases, sometimes the best you can do is have a good response or recovery plan.
Okay. Appreciate that. And I just want to let me mention the book here again. It's Countering Cyber Sabotage by Andy Bochman and Sarah Freemen, covering the consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering, CCE. I will tell you my favorite chapters were 5 and 8, which covered phase 1 and phase 4. I thought Appendix A was excellent. That's the Batvian example.
Baltavia,
Baltavia,
the rich country of Baltavia, which has fine skiing and surfing and a rich cafe culture.
Baltavia, yes. And then we didn't mention, I meant to earlier, but then Appendix B has 10 pages of checklists for the different phases that I think other people will find valuable as well. So that's all out there. I'd encourage you to get the book. And I guess just to close, I would say, I know the book was very generous in recognizing people that had contributed to the industry. Throughout, you mentioned a lot of quotes. I think a lot of my viewers and listeners will recognize many of the names mentioned in the book, but especially the tribute to Mike Asante at the beginning was quite touching and well-deserved. So I just wanted to give you a thank you for putting that in there. You guys, obviously the INL crew was a lot closer than I was, but he meant a lot to the industry, and I thought people will appreciate that. As kind of a closing, I'll give you, do you have any other pitch you want to make for the book? Why someone should read the book before we get out of here?
Yeah, I don't know if I want to lure someone into reading it who otherwise wouldn't. I sort of feel like I want them to come to it out of their own compulsion. But I do want to encourage any company that considers itself a prospective partner on the training side or on the engagement side to please come to us, to come to me. We are maxed out pipeline-wise 5 years into the future with engagements that involve national security things, DoD and defense critical energy infrastructure. We really need to get people licensed up, trained up, and out doing their own versions of CCE that we help them do. So that's that's a really urgent thing for this year. And lastly, or secondly, I'll say, I'm glad you appreciated the call outs of all the folks. I knew that you would know everybody, that because you are in the center of this whole universe. And so I hope you found it sort of as a useful historical document to telegraph, to call out the various people who've been the giants, what is it, on whose shoulders we stand. Mike, as first perhaps among them in some ways, but so many others played a huge role in the book, and by extension in the methodology that it documents.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a show. Thanks again to Andy Bochman and Sarah Freemen for coming on to talk about their book, Countering Cyber Sabotage. It is definitely a good addition to your ICS security library. I hope it drives some change in the industry, and it's really good just to see the details along this thing that we were all encouraged about when we heard about it originally. So check it out. And other than that, I just want to encourage you, if you have any questions on this episode, if you go to dale-peterson.com, my website, and you look at the right side, you'll see record your question. You just click on that, speak into your microphone, give me your question, and we'll answer it on a future episode of the Unsolicited Response Show. So that's it for now, but I'll talk to you next time. Something warrants an unsolicited response.